Hello to all of you. We're getting ready to get started. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Anyone Can Write a Grant. I'm Janet Nelson, the Director of Library Markets for Demco, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we get started, I just wanted to go through some housekeeping details, and then I'll introduce you to our speaker, and she can start today's presentation. On your screens, you should see a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have a question or if you're having any type of technical issue, please feel free to type something there, and we'll do our best to get back to you as quickly as we can. There will be a pause in the middle of the presentation and at the end of the session to answer questions. If something comes up during the session that you'd like clarification on or want to respond to, I encourage you to go ahead and type something in there, and we'll compile all those thoughts and questions and we'll address them during the breaks. If we don't get to those questions during the breaks or we can't get to all of them, we'll be sure to get answers and post them with the recorded webcast after the event. There's also specific contact information available for Kathy and myself that you should see on the screen right now. After the session, you can feel free to email us directly if you have a specific question that we might be able to help you with. We're also using Twitter today, and the hashtag is #DemcoIdeas. You should be able to see that hashtag on the side of your screen in the chat box, and we are monitoring that feed as well for questions and comments. Just for fun, while I'm doing introductions, we're going to do to pop up a poll question on your screen. And our question today is, just how hard do you think it is to write a grant? So you can fill in your answer, and we'll show you the results once we get those all back. You can take a minute there, and by the end of our session, we're hoping that we can convince all of you that this is something that you're capable of doing. So now on to introductions. As I mentioned, I'm Janet Nelson, the Director of Library Markets for Demco, and I'm moderating the session. At Demco, we're always interested in how to better serve the needs of our customers, and these webinars have really been a great way for us to do this. As library budgets have been stretched over the past several years, it's been important to explore other alternative ways to fund the activities that we're carrying out in our libraries. So today's presentation is going to walk you through some basic principles that illustrate how to confidently develop a focused and effective grant proposal for your library. I am pleased to introduce you to Kathy Hakala-Ausperk, who will be our speaker. Kathy is a library administrator, advocate, speaker, and trainer who believes the future of our libraries depends upon our attitudes towards innovative service. She is currently the Executive Director of Northeast Ohio Regional Library System and a 28-year public library veteran. She also serves as an adjunct faculty member for Kent State University's School of Library and Information Science and is the principal consultant for Libraries Thrive Consulting. As a frequent speaker at national and state conferences, staff days, and workshops, she has a passion for supporting, coaching, and developing successful libraries, staff members, and leaders. She has been a contributor and a guest editor for ALA Allied Professionals Association's Library Work Life, and her book, Be a Great Boss, 1 Year to Success, was published in January 2011 by ALA Editions. Her newest book, Build a Great Team, is now also available through ALA Editions. Kathy, we're going to put the controls in your capable hands, and you can get started when you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much, Janet. I'm just going to bring up my first slide. Clicking on this. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that very nice introduction. I think there's one more microphone still open, the organizer microphone, but other than that, we're ready to go. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar today. I'd like to start by telling you that in a library not too far from where I'm sitting right now, there are, I hope, a lot of children, a lot of preschoolers, who are learning and building reading skills in a special spot in the library called Pre-Literacy and You, or the Playroom. And the reason I mention this to you is because the Playroom exists because I wrote a grant. I can't believe that I wrote it. I did not write it myself, as I'm going to talk quite a bit about this during this hour. I had a lot of help. I had a whole team. But it was something that I thought was more than just moderately painful, which seems to be the majority opinion here today, and I never thought it was something that I could really pull off. But by taking a class and by doing some research, and most importantly by getting an awful lot of help, we were able to get a grant for over $25,000, and we were able to build a playroom that functions. So when you start thinking about budgets, of course, the first thing you think about is stability. Everybody who's in charge of any part of a budget knows that they have to be able to keep stability going financially to keep their organization functioning. We've had a lot of changes in libraries. I don't have to tell you. I'm sure no matter where you are, you've felt them as well. And it has been the job of our leaders to make those adjustments in staffing and contracts and other expenditures so that we could remain stable. But in addition to that, we've had a new twist thrown into libraries that wasn't there many, many years ago, and that has to do with the growth of revenue. There's been so many more services and activities charged to us to accomplish, often with less money and fewer people, that grant writing has become something that libraries have really had to jump into and have had to build their skills for. If you're like me, you probably thought when you first heard of grant writing that it was something you have to hire somebody to do, that it was something that was so specialized you could never accomplish it. But I hope I can convince you today that you can accomplish bringing more money into your library to either support and strengthen the resources and the services you already offer, or maybe to add those really special things, that value-added service that we so desperately want to give to our communities. But there's no doubt about it. Adding to our revenue and building those additional revenues through grants is something that really has become a part of all of our jobs. And the more we learn to build skill in that area, the more valuable we too are to our libraries. So I thought I'd start by getting the excuses or the negativity out of the way. And these were all my excuses at one time or another. As I said, most people will say they can't afford to hire a grant writer. We can't add to our staff. We've been cutting to our staff. What I'm going to suggest to you today is that although grant writing is an industry in itself, and I'm sure it is a formidable one and does wonderful things for larger organizations, in a library setting it isn't necessary to have somebody paid on your staff to write these grants. There's a lot of talent in your community. There's a lot of talent on your staff, and you have talents to bring together the pieces and parts that make an effective proposal. So you don't have to go out and hire somebody to do this for you. Most people will say they don't have the time, and that again is because mostly of staff cuts. But once again, the secret to writing these grants is to think of them as jigsaw puzzles and to bring together a team of people to put that puzzle together for you. When you break it apart like that and you give everybody the assignments that match their particular talents, that's when you're making the best use of everybody's time, and no one person has this huge job on their shoulders that they can't fit into the rest of their work. I hear a lot of people tell me, nobody will give us money. We're government entities, government agencies, we're funded by tax dollars or through our state government or various places, so nobody's going to give money to us. To that I would suggest, if you look at what is being funded, if you look at the things that the funders want to support, you're going to find that they are exactly what we are doing in libraries. They are things like early reading skills, pre-literacy activities that ensure school success, helping get the unemployed back to work, helping help people with resumes and interviews. These are the kinds of things that are focused on youth services and all of the issues that are in our culture right now that need to be resolved. We do them already. So people will fund what libraries are doing if we go about approaching the application in the right way. If you think you can't write, I want to assure you that not every piece of these grant proposals is all about narrative. As I said, you're going to have to be looking for various skills to bring together in your grant team. And if writing isn't one of them, then maybe you're going to be in charge of the oversight or the organization or the budget or some other component of the plan. But I can assure you not being able to write colorfully is not going to be something that stops you or holds you back from getting that extra money. And finally, I certainly hope I can convince you that it isn't too complicated. Anything, almost any concept we can think of, we can make complicated. But just as with this webinar today, this is not going to be an academic approach to grant writing. This is not going to be an overly detailed or analytical approach. This is going to be an uncomplicated approach and it's based on a lot of advice that I've collected over the years, and also towards the end I'm going to share some advice that I went out and got from two people who do this for a living and have long careers working in libraries and in grants. So we can simplify this and make it something that's as easy to do as planning your summer reading program, which is an enormous task that most people in libraries undertake with no worry at all. So that's where we're going to go, and that's what I'm going to achieve and convince you of before this hour is over. The first thing you need to have is confidence. As I said, you are going to be able to learn how to approach the proposal. You can certainly learn kind of secrets about grant writing and about grant proposals. I don't have to tell you how many books there are on the subject. You're all working in libraries. You've seen your collections. But remember, there's a lot of other opportunities to learn about grant writing as well. Local community colleges will often offer training for nonprofits or libraries. A lot of times you can get speakers or other people who are maybe retired or looking for something to do if they're laid off to come in and help give a couple little pointers to your staff and your team. There are components of it that you can certainly address and really focus on picking up on so that you can build the skill. It is a skill, though, and we keep in mind that all of the complicated and challenging things that we face as library workers, they didn't come to us naturally in the beginning, but we did have to learn and hone them, and most importantly, get expert advice from others. So with that advice in hand and that background, you are going to be able to be successful. As I've already said, you're going to have the projects and the proposals and the activities that fill the needs that funders are looking for. And you're going to be able to make sure that your library not only sees a benefit from it internally, but shares that benefit with the community as well, so that it's going to be easier the second time you apply for a proposal, because you're going to have the success of your first project to back you up and to help make that second proposal even more convincing, because funders will be able to see how well you've done. This particular illustration is one of my favorites because grant writing is often thought of as such an enormous task, something that will take months and months and months. But the fact is, it is something that you can and should break down into its parts so that you can do it one piece at a time. The first piece you're going to need is to be ready. And as I said, preparing any way you can with just a little bit more knowledge, attending today's webinar, for example, or finding some other training available in your neighborhood, or even just asking someone who does it if you can have an hour of their time to sit down and get some tips. That's the best place to start. Of all the steps you're going to take, I would strongly suggest that that be your first one. The other thing you're going to need is that team. The second step should always be pulling together a team. I have a team approach to just about every major project I undertake, but especially in grant writing because the components are so different. It's very, very helpful to make sure you've got people on board who are each going to bring that expertise that you need. For example, you're going to need somebody who's good with numbers to help you with the budget part. You're going to need somebody who is good with writing. Not necessarily really flowery and creative, but good with concise, compelling writing, so they can do that narrative part for you. You're going to need somebody on your team who has that big picture, strategic thinking kind of response. So you're going to be pulling together all those people, and you're going to find the more you work with these people and the more you outline what everybody's jobs is, no one is going to be able to feel overwhelmed because they're going to have just a small piece of the work to do, and that piece is going to match their skills and their interests. When you're putting this team together, I would strongly suggest you consider using volunteers as well. I was working at a library once where we needed some help doing grant research, and so we posted a job opening for a volunteer grant researcher. We were surprised and really pleased to get over 20 results, and we ended up with 10 people at our orientation meeting. Now, several of these people had been laid off. One woman said it the best when she said, as I continue going and looking for new jobs, I don't want to say, oh, I've been sitting home watching soap operas since I got laid off last year. I want to be able to say I've been helping my community by volunteering my grant research skills at my local library. Some other people were retired, And some people just had an interest in doing grant research, and they brought those skills together. It was wonderful to have that kind of support to back up the work of the team of staff members. And the expertise and interests and different viewpoints they brought was really valuable. And finally, I would suggest when you're putting this team together, don't forget your staff. This is a really good opportunity to look for a chance to allow staff members who might be in a specific job where their tasks are kind of limited to really stretch and grow. Maybe they have skills, as I said, with creative writing that they don't necessarily use if they're working, say, at the circ desk. But once you bring them on this team and you give them an opportunity to shine, it's just some other aspect or growth in their job that can make it that much more rewarding for them. So don't forget to open this up to experts on your staff. So the first things I mentioned were getting yourself a little bit of background, and maybe that'll just be today, and also getting your team together. The next thing that you're going to need is you're going to need a worthy goal. The most important part and the most often jumped over part of putting together a grant proposal is often we'll see a grant posting, request for proposals, and we'll think, oh, let's apply for that. Let's get that grant. What should we do with it? What should we get it for? And that's backwards. And often that backwards approach is reflected in a refusal of the grant, because starting with a goal in mind that's a really valuable purpose means the most as far as supporting what you're going to be writing about and putting together. So you start with a need. Is there a real need in your community? I can't imagine that any of us would say no to that. Make sure that there's something going on that can be resolved by the program or resource that you're going to offer with your grant, and then get some data to back it up. One of the best methods I've ever heard of to do this was introduced by the Public Library Association in their Turning the Page 2.0 advocacy training. It's called Problem Solution Opportunity. So what you do is you get your team together and you say, what are the problems in our community? Let's say, for example, well, a large majority of people in our community are out of work. They're unemployed, and it's just a huge problem. So what's the solution to that problem? Well, the solution is that they need to get training. Some of them need to go back to school. They need to learn how to interview and write a resume. Many of them haven't done it for 20 years. So what's the opportunity? You take that solution and you turn it into an opportunity for your library to serve the community. And I use this example because I know of a library that actually did problem solution opportunity around this issue. And the opportunity was that the library could open a career center where they hosted programs and brought in speakers and counselors to help with resume writing and interview preparation, where they pulled all their books together on education and getting scholarships for older adults. And they put together this area that really met the need in their community. They had established that need with data and demographics and real facts and figures. That was something that was able to be funded by a grant because the purpose was so clear. Remember, too, that as you're looking at problem solution opportunity, you want to make sure that you're picking a need that has a broad impact. People who are giving their money away want their money to do the most good for the most people. So it's important to realize when you're writing this proposal, the people reading it are going to think, okay, well, this project is really only going to help about, what, maybe 30 people in 4th grade, versus this project which spans 2 or 3 school systems in a county. And that's the next thing I would suggest that you consider. Once you've got that goal in mind, think about who else shares that goal. What other entities are out there whose mission is close enough that that goal would matter to them? It might be your local schools. It might be your local government. Maybe there are other nonprofits in your area. We did the Play Grant in a partnership with a local nonprofit parenting group, just an informal group of parents that had gotten together and formed a group to support parenting and early childhood rearing. Think about all the other people who would share that goal and bring them together onto your team and involved in going after this grant. And the solution can have that much of a greater effect for more people. Now, no matter what kind of a grant proposal you write, you're always going to have to state your objectives. And one thing funders have in common is they really want those objectives to be very, very clear. So you're going to have to state that problem you've identified and articulate the data that you have to support it so you can make sure to convince them, yes, this is a real problem. Here's the proposal we have, here's the service we want to put in place, or the program or the collection we want to buy to be part of the opportunity to solve the problem. What will it do? What impact will it have? Those are going to be your objectives. So make sure that once you've gone through your first few steps, you say, okay, we've decided we're going to have a career center. What will be the objectives of the career center? This is a really important place to spend a lot of time from your team clarifying these objectives, because these are often kind of the turning point in decision making and getting a grant. So your objectives might be, for example, we want to help we want to primarily help people over 50 realize how to go back and do interviews when they haven't done it for a long time. We want to help people who want to go to college find the money that they need to the scholarship information. You want to get really specific about what this great program, this great idea that you have is going to do, what impact it's going to have. And you want to make sure that you've got your thoughts together. Now what I'm doing now is, before we talk about writing the grant proposal itself, I'm just giving you kind of the overarching concepts of having your goal and having your objectives. And of course you have to remember that you're going to have to be thinking about how you're going to measure your success. That's another almost universal element of grant proposals, that no matter what you're asking or whom you're asking, they're going to want to know, how will you know that you've achieved this? So I would suggest that you make sure when you're putting those objectives together, you think about them in a way that they're going to be measurable. The best thing to do is to keep it as broad as you can, but still be realistically measurable. You're going to have to do probably some maybe quarterly or monthly reporting throughout the process of having the money and actually putting your plan into action. And there's going to be lots of opportunities to make sure you're being successful, or to tweak what you're doing so you can be successful. And the more prepared you are, thinking about that ahead of time, the easier that part of your grant proposal is going to be for you to write. Remember, you might have to take benchmark measurements. You might have to look at how many people are unemployed in my community, and how many people will give us responses after they've used our career center that they got a job. Remember also that you don't want to just measure numbers. Just like in libraries, we don't want to be gauged on our success or our failure only by our circulation numbers. You're not going to want your project to be measured that way either. So keep in mind that as you put your project that you're going to get funded into action, you've got to look for those stories and those anecdotes. So when somebody comes back in and says, I can't believe it, I got the job, get somebody to capture that story so that can be incorporated in your reporting and your measurement. And again, if you're getting a little bit nervous now thinking about measurements and benchmarks and things like that, don't worry about that, because you're going to have somebody on your team who loves this kind of stuff. You know, I'm one of those people who loves diagramming sentences. Not many people are like that. So there's got to be people out there who like spreadsheets and measurements and counting, and you're going to make sure that you have one of those people on your staff, on your team, I mean. The other piece to be thinking about as you're kind of brainstorming and putting together components that you're going to use in these grant applications. And notice I say applications, because once you get all of this together and once you've identified a really valuable goal, you're going to not want to just do one. You're going to want to use these pieces over and over until you actually get that money. So another concept to be thinking of and to be kind of putting together as another piece of this jigsaw puzzle is a timeline. When you get into writing specific proposals, you're going to see that there are usually timelines and limitations and calendar requirements for each individual funder, so you can adjust your timeline to that. For example, you might get $10,000 from an organization that wants it all expended within 90 days and wants a final report within 9 months. They're all going to be a little bit different. But you want to start with a realistic, big picture timeline that shows you you've really picked the right activities to fit into a reasonable amount of time. You're going to tweak that, as I said, as you go along, and you match the very, very specific details of time that they're given. Remember also, be very, very careful of deadlines. Make sure that that detail person on your team or somebody on your team is a calendar watcher. I once lost a grant because I had my application in by 5:30 on the day it was due, but I hadn't read the directions to see that a paper copy was due by 5:30, not an e-copy. So I actually missed that paper copy deadline. Be very, very careful when you're thinking about your timeline that you don't do the same thing. And one last major thing to consider are your partners. With whom will you be undertaking this project? And as I said, a general rule of thumb is the more partners, the better. You know, a lot of times you can get people to agree to partner with your grant proposal without even having to ask them to actually be on the team or come to a meeting or write anything, but just getting their support. And maybe they'll agree to market your program because it matches the mission of their organization. Everybody doesn't have to become a partner only if they're willing to do a lot of work. So think broadly when you and your team are brainstorming. Once you've identified that problem and the solution and the opportunity, once you have your goal and you've stated objectives about how can we actually impact this, what will our project achieve, spend a good deal of time brainstorming who else would care about this, to whom else would this matter. Again, the Playroom was not only partnered with a parenting organization but also with the schools in the city, and it was a wonderful benefit to have them sign on as partners in this undertaking. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pause for just a few minutes before I talk about budgets and really good tips and see if Janet has any questions that have come in that I can answer.
We do have a few questions that have come in, and keep those coming in, and we'll be able to make sure that we get those answered at the end, or like I said, through our Q&A log. One question is it better to ask for a small dollar amount versus a large dollar amount?
Well, in most cases, you're probably going to be limited. Most grant definitions include how much money can be asked for. But often it's a range. So they might offer a grant up to $25,000 or up to $10,000. My suggestion would be not to worry too much about if you're asking for too much, but to just make sure that your objectives match your budget. So in other words, if you want to have, I hate to keep using this example, but it's my best one. If you want to open a playroom that's going to be, 20 by 20, and usually there's, going to be maybe 10 or 15 kids in there, don't ask for 50 iPads. If you can make sure that your requests, and especially the prices you assign to them, are realistic and really match what you're exactly doing and with whom, I wouldn't worry about going right up to the limit. It's just when it seems like it's off and it seems like it's padded that you might run into a little bit of trouble.
Okay, a second question that we have is how long should the grant application be?
Well, I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, and I can tell you that for most 99% of all funders, they're going to tell you exactly how long it should be. Most funding authorities, whether they're state governments or state library or foundations, have very specific grant guidelines. The most important thing to remember is that you follow them. So if they say we want an abstract that's not more than 1 page, keep it to less than 1 page. But they're going to tell you very specifically how long everything should be. And just like a job interview, you want to make sure you answer each question, you provide the information in each section that's asked for concisely but in a compelling way, and that you don't go over it. I was an M on the LSTA Advisory Council for the State Library of Ohio, and so I've done quite a bit of reviewing of grant applications. And as Janet and I were talking before the webinar, because she handled a grant application for Demco, It's very, very hard when you get into these that are just too much information and too flowery, and it's usually because by then they've gone off task and off the question, and you get lost reading it. So the most important thing is to make sure that you're providing the information that's asked for concisely and compellingly, just like you were answering an interview question.
That's really helpful, Kathy, and I'll second that, because when you provide a lot of extraneous information, it may look really nice or it may look really cool, but again, if you're not answering the questions, it's very, very difficult to award that money. So, okay, I think what we're going to do now is just let you go ahead, and then we'll save any other questions until the end. I think we'll have plenty of time to answer quite a few questions at that time.
Okay, great. Well, before I get to the advice that I've gathered from these experts, I do want to talk for just a second about budgeting, because budgeting for these grant applications is really a critical component. Again, hopefully you're going to have somebody on your team who's really good with numbers, but making sure that, number one, you follow the guidelines that are required. For example, do they include an estimate of staff time as part of your local contribution or not? Also, do they have limitations on how much money has to be matched from the library budget? There's all kinds of real specific requirements and guidelines having to do with money, and it's really important that you get somebody who's going to really take that requirement apart and understand it and provide it along those guidelines. One of the first grant applications I ever wrote, I was doing my own spreadsheet work, which, as I've just told you, I'm not very good at. And I ended up losing the grant because I didn't add a column up right, and I was $24 over the limit. So I can't say enough how important it is to make sure that your budgeting is accurate. Also, it helps when you provide an appendices to your grant proposals. So if you say you're going to buy a smart board to do children's story hours, find a smart board that matches your needs and has a price on it, so that when you put an estimate in your budget, you can illustrate that it's a realistic estimate. It doesn't mean you're going to have to go out and buy that one, but just make sure that you've got some really good estimates in place. So once you know how much money you need, where do you find it? That's probably the biggest question I get when it comes to how can I get a grant. And as many of you probably know, you have a lot of opportunities to do things here differently. You can start with your state library, for example. Look for LSTA opportunities. The Library Services and Technology Act. Quite often there are grants available through state libraries with this money. You can go more nationally and use the Foundation Directory. The Foundation Center Library, we have one in Cleveland, I know there's one in New York, but several years ago they started opening what are called cooperative agencies, so a lot of libraries now have access to the same databases and information about funders. And again, you can make sure that you're using local information. It always helps to start local. So look in your newspaper, look in your local newspaper and see what's been funded. If they just added some kind of a special program at your local school for elementary students, maybe it was funded by a small nonprofit or maybe even a family in your community. So look to see what else is being funded. And at this point, it's really a good idea for you to get some real good expertise. There are opportunities to hire people from, for example, the Foundation Center libraries to just do this research for you, to just do the research to come up with a list of potential funders that match that goal and those objectives you've identified. But again, you can also try using volunteers in your community or maybe in your local college or high school. One thing that's important to remember about volunteers, volunteer work should be, in my opinion, limited to doing research to find funders or helping you actually put together the nuts and bolts of the grant. But when it comes to actually having contact with the funders, those relationships really matter. And in most cases, funders want to deal with the director or the person in charge of the grant. So make sure that that part of the obligation of the work isn't handed off to someone else. But get as much help as you can looking around to find where you're going to send that grant proposal. And one of my top tips is relationships. Again, building relationships with those funders, with their agents, or if it's a small family fund with the family, matters. They like to come to your library. They like to see the customers they're going to be helping. They like to meet the staff members with whom they're going to be working. So if you have the opportunity to work with a funding organization that's in your area, make the effort to write those handwritten notes and take them out for coffee and make that extra connection, because quite often that can make all the difference in the world. It also helps to build trust and confidence in you the more they get to know you and your library and see that their money is actually going to be put to good use. The other suggestion I would give you is if you can volunteer to do grant application reviews anywhere, including with your state library, volunteer. It's a wonderful opportunity when you're grading grant applications and proposals to see how they get analyzed, what's important and what isn't, and comparing 15 of them and seeing the 3 that get funded. It's probably the best education I've gotten ever for grant writing, was serving as a reader and a grader of other people's grants proposals. My next piece of advice is keep it interesting. As I just said, people who read grant proposals, sometimes they've got a pile in front of them. You've got to make sure that your writing is really compelling, your questions are being answered, your program is exciting, the impact that's going to have is interesting and important. Make sure that when you read it, and I would suggest you get somebody else to read it before you send it in, hopefully somebody who knows nothing about libraries. Make sure it's interesting and it's going to really grab their attention and get them excited about giving you money. And the last point of mine is to always use these jigsaw puzzle pieces over and over again. You're going to have to tweak them. You're going to have to make sure that they match the specific requirements of the grant. But the components of budgeting and costing things out and reaching objectives and the data that you gather to support the need, those things can be recycled and put into the next grant application that you write as well. And one thing I'll say about all those pieces and parts, one of the best template ideas I was ever given that I use is when I'm getting ready to write a grant proposal, I'll go into the page that shows me the requirements, and often it'll even give you the whole format, and it'll have a bold outline of this is your summary and then a 2-page objectives. And what I do is I take that directions page and I copy it and I remove all of their directions and I just keep those bold headings so that when I'm putting my information in, I'm putting it in exactly as they've asked for it. Because otherwise, once you start putting a lot of pieces together, sometimes you can end up with things not being as organized. And I can tell you from the perspective of a grader, you grade by section, so everything has to be right where it's supposed to be in order to get full credit. Okay, so what do you do if all this work comes to naught and the answer is no? Well, the first thing you do, as you can imagine, is you thank them for considering it and you ask them for some tips on how to improve it. Where did you fall short? What other information could you have put in to make it a stronger proposal? Learn everything you can from every single funder with whom you interact, because everything you learn is going to make your next application that much stronger. And then take those jigsaw pieces and try again. Find another funder who is supportive of the topic you're trying to achieve and try another proposal. Don't give up. These aren't automatic and they don't come right away no matter how carefully you are. You might have to try and try and try until you finally get the right answer. And when you get that answer, I would suggest you consider doing the same things you did when the answer was no. Thank them for considering your proposal. Ask them why you got it. What was strong about that application? What did they like about it? Because again, you're just continuing to develop the education for you and your grant team, so next time you can be sure to do the same thing. And then make sure that you keep your promises, meet the deadlines, meet all the obligations that you've promised. Again, this is where you put everybody to work with their own piece, but make sure that you carry through and then thank them at the very end by somehow showing them the output, the anecdotes, the stories. Give them a couple impact stories that'll show them what a great, great success this grant was. And finally, make sure that you at that time share your success with everybody else in your library and all the stakeholders you had involved. So the next time you decide to write a grant proposal, they're going to be able to see how successful you are, and they're going to be more eager to jump on board and help you with the next one. I talked to 2 different people to get some advice for a chapter I wrote on grant writing. The book is listed in the resources that Janet's going to give you. It's called Library Management 101. The first person I spoke to had worked her whole career in philanthropy, and I asked her, what 3 tips would you give to people who were getting ready to write a grant? She said, number 1, research the funders. Pay attention to the organization you're going to be sending your proposal to, and make sure that what you're proposing really matches what they say they want to fund. Don't assume that you're going to be the exception to the rule and they're going to fund your program even though it isn't one of the things that they say they're interested in, because you're going to convince them. Make sure you research them carefully. Make sure you've got a good match. Her second tip was write concise, clear proposals that follow the guidelines. She said one of the ways that even some wonderful looking programs were denied was because their proposals by the deadline did not include all of the components that were supposed to be there because people just didn't follow directions. And that's kind of a heartbreaking thing. Quite often you'll get that feedback when you get your rejection, but that might mean you have to wait for the whole next grant cycle to start up again. And her third tip is keep a calendar and meet those deadlines. The last thing funders want to have to do is come after you and say, where is your report? Where is your quarterly report? Where are your results statements? Make sure that you've got somebody keeping that calendar, watching that deadline, and making sure things are getting in on time. The next person I asked has worked with LSTA funds for many, many, many years. So she has grant proposal experience specific to libraries. The first thing I asked her was, what are 3 really common mistakes that people make? And you'll be surprised, or maybe won't be, at the correlation to my previous expert, because she said the single most common mistake is that people don't follow instructions. The second mistake is that they don't proofread, really simple proofreading even for typos, even if beyond some of the bigger mistakes or omissions. Her solution to both of those, by the way, was see if the funder will take a look at your first draft. You know, a lot of times they will. You have to remember that people who work for organizations that give away money have a job to give away the money. Their job isn't to keep it. It's to find excellent services and programs to fund so that the mission of their organization is met. They want you to get the grant. So a lot of times you can call them, you can ask questions for clarification. I know of several who will say, just send me the whole proposal a week before it's due and I'll read it and tell you what's missing. So if you're having trouble with the instructions, or if you want somebody to proofread it, ask them if they'll proofread it for you. And she said the third most common mistake is that often people don't understand the difference between goals and objectives and action steps. And I think that goes back to 2 things. The first is, like I said, you want to get started by getting yourself at least a little bit of rudimentary background and training in this, just enough to know what these terms are. And secondly, to make sure that you pick up the phone or you email and you call them and say, is this a clear enough goal? Get some feedback from them before you turn something in. So then I asked her, what are your 3 tips? What's the best advice you can give people who are just getting started in writing grants? Number 1, ask questions. She reiterated what I had said and what I had learned a long time ago. A lot of times you can pick up the phone and call me and I'll tell you whether or not something is going to be accepted or whether you should add more to it. So number 1 was ask questions. The second tip she gave was make sure that the project is tied to your mission. And again, that goes back to problem, solution, opportunity. Funders want to see that the organization asking for the money, who are going to do the work to solve the problem, that that's part of what they do. That's part of their natural mission. And the third tip she had was have partners. As many partners as you can possibly have, and the more the better. So those are the pieces of advice that I was able to get from some of these experts. And before I go on and wrap up a little bit, Janet, what kind of questions do we have at this point?
Okay, we have quite a few good questions, so keep those coming. Okay, one of the first ones here is, should anecdotes be included in the actual grant application as opposed to just the post-grant results?
I think that depends on the directions that you get for the application, but by all means, the more human, the more compelling that you can make your proposal, the more likely you're going to get it funded. So for example, if it says, give us a one-page summary of the reason for the grant, absolutely, if you've got a really quick story that you can share and still give the reason and still keep within the one-page limit, absolutely, make it something that they can't put down, especially because, you know, most grant proposals start with some kind of a summary. I'm here to tell you, I wouldn't be a bit surprised, and I'm sure you wouldn't be either, if a lot of them just get set aside after that first page is read, because it just doesn't speak to the person. It doesn't sound interesting. It gets put in the, well, here's the maybe pile. I'm going to keep reading until I find some good ones pile. You know, in the advocacy class I mentioned, from which I got the problem solution opportunity, they talk about different ways to craft your message. And sometimes you craft it very statistically because that's the audience or that's the requirement. Other times you craft it using an anecdote because that's what they're asking for, that's the kind of organization that it is, so you tell a little story. But other times you tell what they call an emotionally inspiring story. So I guess the point is it depends on how much space you have, making sure you stay within that limitation and you answer the question. But if you can do that with an anecdote, you're probably going to bring your project to life even more, and you're going to catch their attention and get them to read on and consider you more seriously.
You know, in addition to that, Kathy, one thing that I found when I was working through the grants that we were doing, and that was for a space makeover, but one of the things that was always compelling to me was people who were already showing that they were working towards their goal. So they were maybe, they didn't have the money to start the project, but they were doing things that cleaned up the space. Or they were finding other funding to start the project in small ways. Because to me that also showed that they were committed to the project, and I was sure that that would get completed. So that's just another thing that I could recommend from my experience.
You know, that's a really good point. Even with the Playroom, we were able to say that we had been doing a weekly program where we would drag all these toys out of a closet and set them up because they all built reading skills, reading readiness skills, and that this program was hugely popular and we had X number of kids every week. But now we want to expand that and we want a more permanent setting for this popular, successful program so we can impact children more often than once a week. So that's a really good point. If you have that success in your background, definitely bring that up.
Okay, another question here would be, where do you find grants that cross goals? An example would be, I'd like a techmobile that's eco-friendly with Wi-Fi, iPads, etc.
Well, you have an opportunity anytime to get more than one grant for any project. So, you know, that kind of a project might appeal to an organization that likes to support the environment and eco-friendly ideas. And then you might also get money from an organization that likes to close the technology gap and provide underprivileged areas with access to computers. I don't think you should ever limit a project to just one funder. If you can get more than one, that's a benefit. I can't imagine, and I'm sure it's out there, and you know, I don't have 50 years experience in this, I may not have come across it, but I can't imagine that one funder isn't going to, you know, would have any kind of a problem with that, as long as, again, you're meeting their requirements and doing the pieces that they support. As a matter of fact, I would think it would strengthen a proposal to be able to say, we already have partial funding for this from this organization, plus we have this money from our budget that we've committed, but we still need money to get the books and the laptops, etc.
Great advice. Again, another question that a couple people had, you were talking about becoming a grader for some of these grant proposals, and the question was, how does one become a grader?
Well, I would suggest that you contact your state library. I think that's the simplest way to start. State libraries get federal money that they give out as LSTA grants. Sometimes they don't give it all out because sometimes they are restricted. You know, they've already dedicated that money to something, but I would start there anyway and see if you can get involved that way. The other thing is you might want to volunteer to help if your local community college offers a class, for example, on writing grants. You could go in and volunteer to help the teacher and just to help grade those papers. I mean, I teach a class in management. I would not turn away a volunteer grader if I had the opportunity. So those are just a couple ideas that I would suggest.
Okay, here's another one. Often the template looks like a fill-in-the-blank format. Do you use this to fill in, or do you create a separate document using those headings to write a grant?
Well, I guess it depends on how specific their directions are. They might say, you know, you have to use this form, but for the most part, it doesn't really matter if you type into it or if you recreate it. The reason I don't recreate it is because I'm always afraid I'm going to leave something out, so I like to type right into it. But the point is, you just want to make sure that when you're done with that proposal and you're proofreading it, you make sure that every heading is where it's supposed to be and every piece of information is under the appropriate heading. So like I said, that's often how proposals are graded, where each section gets a certain number of points. You know, I've graded proposals before where there's sections that call for certain parts of the description that's missing, but then, you know, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages later, I see mention of what was supposed to be over in the other part, and it makes it very much harder to grade, and quite often it doesn't do the proposal any good at all.
Okay, we have another one around, I have been under the assumption that it is not appropriate to ask why you didn't receive the grant. Is there a clue to look for that would suggest that it's okay for an organization to ask why my application did not receive the grant?
Well, I don't know that I've ever heard that. I mean, I can't imagine you're going to have a contact person to whom you submit the proposal, and I can't imagine that a very respectful, polite email saying, if you possibly have the time, could you tell us how we might have made our proposal stronger, could be turned away. I mean, I suppose the worst that can happen is that they can say, we don't have time to tell you that or something. But I think the most important thing to do is to make sure that they realize that you are passionate about what you're doing. And so I would say something like, you know, we would appreciate any advice as to how we could do this better the next time, because we do intend to move forward with this project and we're very serious about getting funding. I mean, I think that demonstrates a commitment and a passion to what you're doing. I'd be surprised if anybody was averse to that. And like I said, if they don't possibly have the time, then they'll probably just tell you that.
And you know, speaking on that subject too, from my past experience, I usually did have a couple people come back to me and ask what they could do to improve their application in the future. So I had no problem going back and answering that question myself either. So.
And you know, like I said, these funders want to give this money away. I mean, they aren't doing their job if they report to their supervisors at the end of the year, nope, we didn't help anybody learn how to read. And they want to give that money away. That's their job. So they want you to get better at it so that you can come back to them with a really strong program that they can fund. Your success is their success.
Great. We're probably going to take just one or two more questions, but the next one that we have is, will newspaper clippings or articles help the cause or objective or goals of the application?
If they mean newspaper clippings about programs that, well, let me put it this way, if like in my example, if they've had real successful programs for children to help them learn to read and now they want to expand it, then I would definitely put something like that into the appendix of the proposal. Anything that can demonstrate that you've had success doing what you've been doing but you just want to do more of it would be beneficial, I believe. Just like you will often be asked to include resumes for people who will be involved in administering the grant, it's just a way that the funders want to have to be confident that you know what you're doing and that people involved are good at it and they can be successful. So yeah, I would put anything like that into the appendix. There's usually no limit on the appendix.
I guess my piece of advice on that from my past experience would be make sure it's relevant to what you're doing, though, because just putting a lot of information that's general about your library, if that's not exactly what the grant is about, can again just add to the clutter of what you're trying to convey in your message. So that's my only caution on that particular one. Okay, I'm going to take one last question, and that is, I've heard of people applying for the same grant multiple times. Is this standard practice?
I think it's standard practice as long as the proposal looks different each time and looks better. Absolutely. I know, a lot of times that's why I suggest that if you don't get it, you ask, how can I make it stronger, and then make it stronger. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Again, if you have identified a real need that you've supported with data and you have a successful, impactful service that you want to offer to meet that need, then I say keep applying until you find the money. But I would definitely suggest that you make sure that the proposal looks different than it did the last time.
Okay, with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. We'd like to thank you, Kathy, for sharing your insights and your tips on how we can all write more effective grant proposals for our libraries, and we hope that everyone was able to take away a few new ideas to try. There was some great discussion today, and we appreciate all of you sharing your time with us. You will be receiving a survey at the end of the webinar to let us know how we did. Please take a few moments to fill this out. We'd love your feedback so that we can make these sessions even better in the future. Feel free to comment on other topics that you'd like more information on or speakers that you'd like to hear from so that we can consider building some of these into our future schedule. We've received great feedback from our previous webinars, and that's really helped us to focus on the topics that you're most interested in. Tomorrow you'll receive a follow-up to this presentation, and that will include a link to this webcast. So if you missed something or just wanted to review, you can go back and refresh yourself on some of these topics or share with your colleagues. Next week, you'll be receiving a second email that will include resources such as the slides, a Q&A log that documents and answers the questions that came up today, and some additional reference material that can give you more tools as you're preparing for your grant proposals. Again, thank you for joining us today. We'll be back again next month on October 9th with a webinar on collaborative spaces presented by Tracy Lesneski from MSR Architecture. And on November 6th, author and media specialist Tony Buzzio will be discussing Common Core and how it's an unparalleled opportunity for school librarians to shine. So feel free to register for these programs and watch the Demco website for new programs kicking off our 2014 schedule. And we'll be continuing to send emails announcing new webinars in the months to come. We hope that you will consider joining us for some of these future events. And again, we're so glad you joined us today and hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.